Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Now, it's been compared to the poll tax or Gordon Brown's 10p tax fiasco. But so far, the Chancellor is not for turning on his plans to cut tax credits. They're likely, though, to cause problems for millions of working poor. And there is now a growing chorus of disapproval from the Chancellor's own side. Mr Osborne says the reforms, which could see 3.3 million families lose an average of £1,300 from next April, usually at the lower end of the pay scale too, they're a key component of his plan to reduce the budget deficit. So what's all the fuss about? The current system of working and child tax credits was introduced by the then Labour Chancellor Gordon Brown in 2003 as a means of redistributing income by paying money to families with children or working people on low incomes. About 4.5 million people claim them, with current estimates showing that around £30 billion a year are spent on tax credits. That's 14% of the total welfare budget. Before the election, the Conservatives promised to find £12 billion of welfare cuts, and a month after polling day, Prime Minister David Cameron said he would end the ridiculous merry-go-round of taxing low earners, then paying them back in benefits. Chancellor George Osborne used his summer budget in July to announce plans to reduce the income threshold in tax credits from £6,420 to £3,850. While the government will also increase the proportion of credits it takes away above this threshold, a mechanism called the taper rate, from 41% to 48%. On September the 15th, MPs backed the Chancellor's plan, voting by 325 to 290 to bring in the tax credit cuts next April. But on Monday, the Lords gets its turn to vote on the matter. Now, convention dictates that peers cannot reject bills which appeared in a government's manifesto or are financial in content. But Liberal Democratic peer Baroness Manzoor has tabled what is known as a fatal motion, which, if backed, would see the tax credit changes rejected. And with 249 Conservative Lord and Ladies coming up against 212 Labour, 176 crossbench and 111 Lib Dem peers, the government falls well short of the majority it needs in the upper house to defeat a united opposition. And joining me now from Kendal is the Liberal Democrat leader, Tim Farron, and from Nottingham, the former Conservative Chancellor, Ken Clarke. Welcome to both of you. Ken Clarke, let me come to you first. Are people on tax credits strivers or shirkers?
They're strivers, of course they are, but you've got to have a sensible way of alleviating poverty amongst them and supporting them. Obviously, the whole point of a budget and the welfare state is to alleviate poverty. But when you've got to reform it, and when you're trying to take £12 billion out of it because of the needs of the national economy, it's time to start bringing some common sense back into it. Tax credits never were common sense, and we were accidentally subsidising a low-pay, low-productivity economy, and we've steadily got to move away from doing that.
In what way are you alleviating poverty among some of the lowest paid people in the country by making them a single earner, a couple, or a lone parent with two kids, by making them £1,500 worse off? In what way does that alleviate poverty?
Well, as you know, as the Chancellor keeps saying, we're increasing the support for childcare, we're introducing the living wage.
That's all taken into account in these figures. That's all taken into account.
What is not calculable is how far the present strong labour market is going to lead wages to continue to go up. The idea that on top of your employer's pay, you get a government bung, government pay on top. And it was introduced so you'd say, you know, thank you, Mr Brown, I'll now vote Labour. He put it up again before the 2010 election as well. This is not a valuable feature of the system. George is improving other features of the system, and never been a better time to do it, because Real incomes are going up by 3% a year. Employment's very high. You can only tackle this difficult question when you have a strong labour market.
All right.
And it could
No,
remain
hold on,
strong.
Mr. Clarke. I need to bring Tim Farron in now.
Surely.
Mr. Farron, tax credits cost $30 billion a year now. It's almost 15% of the total welfare budget, a lot more than that if you take pensions out of the welfare budget. Is that too much? And if it is, would you cut it in a different way?
Well, I think Ken Clarke is right to say we need to balance the budget. We agree with each other on that very definitely. The question here is, how do you do it? These tax credit cuts, which, as you said, will hit 4.9 million children, 3 million families in this country at an average of £1,300 a year they cannot afford. They will save the taxpayer, or they will save the exchequer, a net savings about £4.5 billion. This is all about choices, because there are other ways you could have found that money. The government could instead have decided not to give away nearly £1 billion in inheritance tax cuts to very wealthy people, or give away £2.5 billion of cuts in corporation tax to big companies, or they could have chosen the Liberal Democrat policy of taxing high value wealth in terms of expensive properties. All of that would have matched the £4.5 billion they're going to save.
But it doesn't get you. It doesn't get you the.
About
It doesn't, because you're committed. You said in your speech as the Lib Dem leader to the conference, your first one this year, that you're committed to balancing the current budget, which is the same as abolishing the structural deficit.
Yep.
That, how do you do that without $12 billion in welfare cuts? Because what you've just said gets you there, but it gets you nowhere. Gets you nowhere near $12 billion.
Yeah. So I've just explained to you some of the ways we would have done it.
Yeah, but you're still short.
The Tory party chose, it chose to commit to £12 billion worth of welfare savings. It did not need to do so. Remember, there's not a single tax rise in the Conservatives' plans for the wealthy. And what we're talking about here in a tax credit cut is effectively a tax rise targeted on the poorest people in this country. The phrase hard-working families is bandied about by politicians in a terribly trite way. But people who work almost every hour God sends in order to put food on the table for their kids and exist just above the bread line are the definition of hard-working families. So we are absolutely committed that we should be supporting those people, and we will block this cut.
Ken Clarke, the Resolution Foundation is headed by a former cabinet colleague of yours. It says more than 1 million households will face an average loss of £1,350. Boris Johnson, the Tory Mayor of London, has warned of a political disaster if you carry on the way you're going. The Sun newspaper says that you're hammering those who work hard and are paid little. Why don't even your natural allies support you?
Well, David Willett surprises me. I mean, we live in a age of short-term, populist, mass media-dominated politics, so it's unfortunately the case that chancellors can't do anything without it being immediately unpopular and lobbied against. But none of these people are suggesting, in any way indicating anything they would cut in the welfare area that would contribute to the very serious problem we still have, which threatens our economic future if we don't tackle it, of just running a deficit all the time. And what you mustn't do is support employers who are paying low pay, therefore not improving their productivity. We are beginning to move into a more sensible economy where employers pay and where steadily the labour market is strengthening and pay is going up.
But
Should
you
never have been introduced tax credits, and if you are going to reform, you've got to, take the tough decisions, as the chancellors are for, and sensibly reform.
Do you have to do it as brutally as many people think you are? After all, you're raising the inheritance tax threshold. That will go to the richest 5% in the country. You've cut the top rate of tax. That goes to the highest earners. But here you are taking a huge chunk of income out of the lowest paid. Why don't you postpone some of that or not do that, and at least don't resolve from the change if that's your policy, but at least make it more gentle, less brutal?
Well, I quite understand this. The instinct of most people is don't take money away from them, don't make me pay for it. There are rich people, particularly rich foreigners. There are big companies, take all the money off them, which if it was as easy as that, I mean, any chancellor would actually do that. What you have to do if you're a chancellor is balance what you're doing to get that healthy, economy that's going to give a good living to our children and grandchildren. And, you know, nowadays, everybody expects the budget to be just full of popular measures. In my day, people were more used to the Chancellor sometimes having to do the tough, difficult things, and they judge you not by the headlines after you've managed to get the majority to get it through. They judge you by whether in 2 or 3 years' time it looks better, it looks as though it's working.
Jim Farron, what's your response?
Well, look, this is not about the Chancellor taking tough decisions to balance the books and being prudent and getting some stick for doing tough but necessary things. This is about choices. Ken Clarke and I agree with each other in a way that people leading the Labour Party at the moment don't agree, that you do need to balance the books. You should clear the deficit.
But you won't get it all from the rich, Tim.
At the moment, what we're asking the poorest paid people in our country to do is to pay the price that the Conservative government is choosing not to ask wealthy people to do. Absolutely balance the books and clear the deficit, but don't do it by charging and taking away from poorest paid, hardest working families in this country, on average £1,300 a year, which will cripple them. And when at the same time, as Andrew, you have just said, you give a inheritance tax cut which benefits the 5% most wealthy. This is about choices, and it's a poor choice made by the Conservative government. One, I do not believe they have a mandate to deliver. Remember, David Cameron 1 week before the election promised that he would not be touching tax credits. Then he did. He has lacked that mandate, I would say, as a consequence. He has no support for this. Many of his own backbenchers, Heidi Allen, I don't want to embarrass her, made a stunning speech last week in defence of the poorest paid people, and we are well within our rights to block this move.
Well, you talk about blocking, it brings me on to the House of Lords, because the Lords may well block it in some form tomorrow, but and you're encouraging your Lib Dem peers to do just that, and you've got about 111 of them, which is about, what, 12 times more than you have MPs. You describe the Lords,
well spotted, yes.
You describe the Lords as, quote, a system which is rotten to the core and allows unelected, unaccountable people to think they're above the law. Why would you use that institution to thwart the policy of a democratically elected government?
So first of all, I'm the one-party leader whose party in the last Parliament did everything in our power to reform and democratise the House of Lords. Labour and Conservatives thwarted us. In this Parliament, we have what we have. So if you're asking me to make a choice between... Indeed, and you're asking me to make a choice now between whether I kind of bow to conventions or whether I stand up for 3 million low-paid families in this country. I back the low-paid families in this country. We have a set of mechanisms in Parliament available to us, and it's absolutely right that we should make use of all of them to prevent the government doing something for which they did not put in their manifesto, they have no mandate to do, and which will impoverish 3 million very, very, very hard-working, just above the breadline or below the breadline families in this country. I make no apologies for using whatever mechanisms are available to us to do that.
Mr. Clarke, has your government not got itself into a right mess? Here is this government self-styling itself as the Workers' Party, and yet here it is as an unelected Lords having to come to the rescue of some of the lowest paid workers in the country. It doesn't look good, does it?
We won the election because working people in this country could see that we were getting steadily better off.
You didn't tell them you were going to cut their tax credits.
We said we were going to take 12 billion out of welfare, and I knew perfectly well, and so did everybody else.
You didn't tell them you were going to cut their tax credits. It wasn't in the manifesto.
Of the 12 billion, we'd have had these rows over again. Going back to the Lords, it's quite serious. I totally agree with Tim. We should have a reformed, elected House of Lords. I voted with him in the last Parliament. It was backbenchers who wrecked it, and it was a very great pity. Now, I have to say, you know, if the Labour and Liberal peers decide to start casting party political votes when they see the government's having a bit of difficulty in order to knock out £4 billion worth of public expenditure savings, it's the end. We really will have to reform and do something about it. I prefer to do that. The Italians have just cut back the power of their Senate because they had chaotic arrangements before. The Americans can't govern the country because Congress stops the president doing anything. We cannot have the curious huge number of peers we have.
Let me just interrupt this.
Spending £4 billion.
Let me just interrupt this political science tour d'horizon and just ask you, if the Lords does thwart the elected government tomorrow, should Mr. Cameron create a ton more of new peers?
That's what Lloyd George threatened to do, or
I know
Asquith
that.
threatened to do in 1911.
I know that too.
No, it would
What
make
should
the Lords,
Mr.
it's got
Cameron do?
ridiculously too many members already, so it would make it even more ridiculous. Personally, I would table the bill we had in the last Parliament and try to explain to our backbenchers that Britain is ready for parliamentary democracy of a sensible kind. But actually, I think there are a lot of Labour and Liberal peers who agree with me. I think a lot of people will try to stop the peers casting silly votes in this debate tomorrow.
We'll see. Mr. Farron, just a final question for you, not on this. The first time we've had a chance to talk to you since you became Lib Dem leader. Mark, it's early days, but mark your own card. How's it going so far?
Well, we're 20,000 members up since the election. You're
down from June, I'm told. I've got your membership down. Down from June.
Pardon? You've got what, sorry?
I've got your membership down from June. It peaked in June and it's now lower in October.
No, it is still going up. I mean, the reality is it's early days, and we know
Indeed.
that in our position now, when we're in opposition with a much smaller number of MPs, our job is to stand up for what I think is a kind of real liberal heart in British politics. What we've seen over the last month or so is the Labour Party making an interesting choice, shall we say, that they're entitled to make, but that creates a vast space on the kind of progressive, socially just, economically competent sphere in British politics, and I hope we're going to fill it. And by taking on issues like this, by not bothering about the perhaps the kind of niceties, but understanding what really matters over the tax credit issue is the people who are going to suffer. I'm bothered about people in my patch and across the country on 12, 13 grand a year who do not know how they're going to feed their kids. So the way back for the Liberal Democrats is to focus on the people who matter, stand up for the outsiders and challenge the establishment.
You're finally going to get some questions at PMQs because you lost that role to the Scottish Nationalists. Are you going to
I've been writing to Jeremy. He's not used one of them yet.
Are you going to crowdsource your questions? Would you like us to email some?
No, I was going to say I've been writing to Jeremy and he's not asked any of my questions yet, so I'll have to use my own this Wednesday. So I've got a thought in my mind. It is a tough one. You know, you only get one every few weeks. You've got to choose your moment. But the other thing to remember, of course, is that PMQs is not the most important thing in the world. There are other ways of getting your message across and making the point. That's why, for example, I'm going to Lesbos tomorrow to highlight the refugee crisis and try to get the government to take a more humanitarian stance on that position too.
It may not be the most important, but it is live on BBC Two on the Daily Politics every Wednesday, and I hope our viewers will join us. We look forward to seeing you in action. Gentlemen, thanks to you both for joining us. Let's move on to this, what the Lords are going to be doing tomorrow on tax credit cuts. The Education Secretary, Nicky Morgan, was on the Marr Show earlier this morning talking about that. This is what she had to say.
I think the House of Lords, as I say, should be very clear. It's a revising chamber. It's there. Often they do make good points, but they are striking down. It's 70% of the votes that they're having. They've already made it more difficult for us on childcare, for example, where they're going to slow down things. Childcare is one of those things that people really want to see delivered, our pledge on that, and the Lords are slowing it down.
So without going into specifics, what you're saying to the House of Lords is be very, very careful before you do that. Think about your own future as a chamber.
Well, I certainly think they should be very mindful of what they are doing. I think this, as I say, is constitutionally unprecedented to strike down a statutory instrument on a taxation and spending matter.
Well, of course, Polly, we live for constitutional crises, don't we? I fear we may be disappointed.
I think we may be, but I wish they would actually blow the whole thing apart. If you have a government that has no intention of reforming the House of Lords, whatever, 800 people in there, I think that the Liberal Democrats, the Labour Party and anybody with any common sense in the House of Lords is entirely free to say, to hell with conventions, Salisbury conventions, the rest of it. We will vote as we feel. You can abolish us if you like, and it would be a damn good thing if you did. But of course they won't, because they love being there. So
well, let's have another 200, because then we would overtake the Communist Party's plenary session in China.
Well, of course, it would make Cameron look absurd if he then said, well, I'll have another 200 and we'll go up to 1,000. That would be entirely insane, and maybe that would push us towards reform. Maybe at last people would say, we can't tolerate this insane system. It looks as if the 26 bishops are going to be the ones that come to the rescue by saying, oh, no fatal motions, we're very moderate, let's just regret. So they're all very powerfully regret these appalling tax credits, when of course they should rebel and not regret.
Would a crisis result in reform this time round? I mean, if we did appoint, as a nation, even more unelected members of the upper chamber, I guess there is a possibility it really would seem more ludicrous to more people.
Yeah, and there's a rich British tradition of stuffing the Lords for political self-interest, which didn't end well last time. I think if there were a constitutional crisis, perversely it would suit the government in the short term because it would muddy the issue of tax credits.
Yeah, it takes the subject off tax credits. We're
Absolutely.
talking about Lords v Commons.
And they're on a far stronger wicket on a conflict with the Lords than on the narrow issue of tax credits, because they can just say, well, we won a general election 5 minutes ago. You're an unelected chamber of 10 billion people. I think we're the only 4 people in London not in the Lords. And it's only a matter of time for you, Andrew. So
I like the way he's talking.
But the big difference
How'd
with
you know I haven't
Lloyd
been offered
George,
already?
That's a good
Lloyd George, there were the Lords, Conservative Lords, being against the people's budget. This time round, the Lords should be rebelling on behalf of, as it were, the people, because they'd be in favour of
the Lords are a
the
progressive force.
Well,
but
if
but
only.
what is interesting is how sort of close we did come to a constitutional crisis, which is that Molly Meacher, a crossbench peer, tabled this fatal motion last week that would have just killed these changes stone dead. And it was her fellow crossbenchers, this is the non-party group, there's 145 of
That
them.
includes the bishops Polly was talking about. as well.
And they said, you cannot do this, we are not a political group.